Right, so what a surprise! What a surprise to hear that in the latest round of ceasefire talks, Benjamin Netanyahu is sabotaging them yet again already. They barely got underway again, and he's playing his favourite trick of changing his demands, this time from previously agreed positions that have been in place since late May. He's denying it, of course, it's always someone else's fault, but unluckily for him there's been a leak. The leak shows no fewer than 5 attempts apparently since May, well before the most recently renewed attempts at talks, well before the latest atrocities meted out against Gaza, and with other nations Israel has now put itself on a war footing with to scupper the ceasefire talks. Israel have repeatedly been the ones doing this. Israel have constantly undermined and wrecked attempts at peace. Yet you'll be lucky to find a media outlet prepared to say that in a headline. But this time round, this news has come from an outlet that has bent over backwards previously to exonerate Israel repeatedly. This time, though, even they haven't had the stomach for it. Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu is wrecking ceasefire talks again, and I say again. I detailed exactly how often and in what ways Netanyahu has consistently been doing this all year long, since January. One of Israel's own newspapers, Haaretz, having got so sick and tired of his dishonest partaking in peace talks, never having any intention of reaching agreement, finding an excuse to abandon it each time. But to listen to the politicians bleat time after time at Hamas to engage meaningfully in peace talks, politicians from all over the world, when actually Hamas have, even to the point of intentionally catching Netanyahu out at one point for the dishonest peace broker he's been, wrong-footing him, we really shouldn't be surprised that Bibi is doing it again. He doesn't want peace. He can't afford peace. He will lose his grip on power if he agrees to peace. And with Israeli elections not due again until 2026, he's really not interested in ending things now. What is a bit different is that it is a prominent US newspaper that has exposed Netanyahu's refusal to engage in peace talks with any intention of arriving at a deal. The New York Times have come in with a scathing piece on Netanyahu's dishonest peace brokering, is what I'd like to say they published, but although they are the ones carrying the story, the headline they attach to it is, well, timid, to say the least. The piece is titled, "Israel was less flexible in recent Gaza ceasefire talks, documents show." Less flexible? Netanyahu isn't an exotic dancer here. There's a horrible mental image. He's a despotic, warmongering genocidalist. Why can't you say that? Al Jazeera put out a piece putting the Times in its place for its quizzling language, ridiculing this description as well, with their piece entitled, "Less flexible? Just say it, NYT. Israel is sabotaging a ceasefire deal." Well, indeed. Exactly so. At least someone can say it like it is without the customary hand-wringing. What has Netanyahu done then, Damo? Well, the document seen by the New York Times outlining what Netanyahu has done remains unpublished for us all to look at. And whilst 5 stipulations are quoted by the NYT, they unhelpfully don't highlight what all of them are, concentrating on a couple of them, which have been put to the negotiators in attendance from Egypt, Qatar and the United States. The biggest issue of them all, to my mind, being Israel's determination to maintain control of the Philadelphia corridor, the border area between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Given that Egypt are a negotiator here, this ought to be an untenable position for Egypt to tolerate, never mind Palestine or Gaza, since it is actually in violation of the Camp David peace accords, the settlement reached between Egypt and Israel in 1979, which ended war between the two countries and has been under strain for several months since now. Several months ago now, though, in violation of those peace accords, Israel did, of course, seize control of the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing and closed it, and shortly thereafter they moved on to seize control of the entire Gaza-Egyptian border, that so-called Philadelphia corridor. Why did they do that, and why do they want to maintain control over it? Well, with the entire Gaza-Egyptian border now under Israeli control, barely any aid has been able to enter Gaza at all. Certainly not now the Israeli military are in control. It's not opening. If seizing the Rafah border crossing was violating the Camp David Accords, then seizing the entire length of the Gaza-Egypt border does so on steroids. And of course it's resulted in all the famine and disease that we've seen spread in Gaza ever since. This strip of land is meant to act as a buffer zone between Egypt and Israel. It's 14 kilometres long, it's not very big, but Israel has seized it, claiming it is an oxygen line for Hamas, which is another direct insult and act of aggression against Egypt, in my view. That would ostensibly be, and I would certainly take it that way. It would be an ongoing direct occupation of Gaza along a strip of land at its southern border that potentially puts it back in conflict with Egypt. And then doing so, then retaining it, serves no purpose at all, except to screw up negotiations and just make diplomatic measures or matters even worse. But not only that, the other main feature the New York Times drew attention to is that Israel wants to restrict who is allowed to return to northern Gaza and who isn't, having a veto, effectively putting border controls back inside Gaza, a vetting process over which Gazans may return to their homes in the north and who must remain displaced. The displacement of any Gazan citizen is a breach of international law, is a war crime, so to argue Israel have a right to keep some people displaced on a whim is ridiculous. It's something nobody can possibly agree to. It's illegal. It can't possibly be found acceptable to anybody, but you just feel it in your water that the US will probably try and sell this as a good deal still. If anyone would, it would be them these days. Here's an excerpt from Al Jazeera's much more plain-speaking piece than the NYT's, telling things exactly like they are. The New York Times confirms in its roundabout way that while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has relentlessly denied trying to block a deal in Gaza and instead blamed Hamas for the deadlock, unpublished documents seen by the newspaper make clear that the behind-the-scenes manoeuvring by the Netanyahu government has been extensive and suggest that agreement may be elusive at a new round of negotiations set to begin on Thursday. In July, Israel relayed a list of new stipulations to US, Egyptian and Qatari ceasefire mediators that added less flexible conditions to the set of principles it had previously provided. Among these new stipulations is that rather than withdraw its military forces from the Gaza Strip in the event of a ceasefire, Israel would instead remain in control of Gaza's southern border with Egypt. But what could the Palestinians possibly find objectionable in the casual maintenance of a brutal military occupation? Israel has also revived its insistence on erecting checkpoints where Israeli soldiers will conduct weapons screenings on displaced Palestinians returning to their homes in northern Gaza, a stipulation that is pretty soundly grotesque coming from the party that is currently perpetrating genocide with all manner of weaponry. In short, it's a simple strategy of moving the goalposts. Whenever it seems that a ceasefire deal might be dangerously within reach, all Netanyahu has to do is throw in a bunch more demands that even members of his own security establishment deem over the top. It is a complete insult to anyone's intelligence that Israel will meaningfully engage in negotiations whilst Netanyahu remains Prime Minister. And of course Hamas have seen this as well as anyone else can, having notified negotiators that after Netanyahu's latest stunt to wreck the latest round of peace talks, there's no point in them engaging in these talks either. And actually in no small way is that Israel's doing too. Hamas's chief negotiator was Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran the other week. Reputationally, he was seen as a moderate voice in these discussions on Hamas's side. But now he's been removed, and the influence is now coming far more from Yahya Sinwar, who is much less diplomatic and whose rhetoric will likely suit Netanyahu far more as somebody who the finger of blame can be pointed at to take the heat off himself for ruining the prospect of peace. But as much as Sinwar might be seen as a less moderate voice, Netanyahu's actions don't make Hamas's view of engaging in peace talks with such a dishonest broker seemingly any less futile. So it's little wonder they see no point in going. But naturally, many more mainstream media outlets are all over that, whilst ignoring what the New York Times are saying, giving the impression, of course, that this is more Hamas's fault and not Netanyahu's doing. Sky News, as for instance, put out an article headlined as "Hamas says it will not join ceasefire talks this week." It's only when you actually read into the article, dig down into the article, that you actually see it mentions why they decided to do that. An excerpt of it reading, "Talks are due to take place on Thursday to discuss a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. However, a Hamas representative in Lebanon told Sky News that delegates from the militant group would no longer be taking part. In a statement, Ahmed Abdul Hadi said Hamas was not against ceasefire talks in principle. However, he said it would not participate this week because Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not interested in reaching an agreement that ends the aggression completely. Rather, he is deceiving and evading and wants to prolong the war, and even expand it at the regional level, and thus he uses negotiations as a cover to continue his aggression against our people and commit more massacres against them," he said. I find it very difficult to disagree with him. Stymieing the process, as this does, essentially freezes everything where it is, with the exception, of course, of the ongoing warfare, the death and the destruction. Israel remains in control of the stuff it wants to be in control of. Netanyahu is avoiding all the charges he faces on corruption and human rights abuses. He avoids his hard-right government collapsing. But above all else, the reality of a Palestinian state is frozen as well, something which is more important than all else to some in Israel, and not least Netanyahu's government itself, that must be stopped. Allowing Netanyahu to keep moving the goalposts time after time is a guaranteed recipe for failure, and that needs to reflect back on the negotiators, who keep putting up with it. Engaging with Israel meaningfully is impossible when they refuse to be an honest broker for peace. And that will continue for as long as Israel's right to disrupt proceedings continues to be protected more by vested interests than the lives of the Gazan people are, who continue to be failed for the national interests of others. Of course, whilst politicians provide ample cover, self-interest of their own nations being the only reason for that, Israeli spokespeople regularly come unstuck defending the indefensible, as the shameless shill for the genocidal state David Menzer found out not once but twice on British mainstream media just the other day. And on both occasions it was entirely self-inflicted, and he deserved it too. Get the details of that double bill of karma in this video recommendation here. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers folks.